Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about the topic of FinOps called unit economics, cloud costs that matter to the business. My name is Gaurav Kapoor, and I'll be talking about the experiences and the way we have identified that unit economics work best for us, and the learnings and all of the challenges we learned during this process. So I'll be talking and sharing about that. Now, before we deep dive into this, let's take a quick look at the agenda. So the agenda for today is that we can understand what is unit economics and what is the need for unit economics. We're going to talk about some of the key metrics. We're going to talk about the approach, how we built the framework, and then we're going to look at some of the sample reports and then also understand some of the challenges we have faced during this process. So before we deep dive into this, let me introduce myself. My name is Gaurav Kapoor. I'm a director for the cloud architecture and FinOps at Deltec. I'm a FinOps certified practitioner and FinOps certified engineer. I've been with Deltec almost 5 years. I'm based in Ottawa, Canada, and it's almost approximately 20 years into this industry. We have been doing FinOps a little bit before it was officially called as FinOps, right? People used to call it different organizations used to call it different things. We used to call it cost management practice. A couple of just logistics things here, right? Before we go deep into the topic and talk and understand about some of the specifics, I just want to make sure that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and did not necessarily reflect the official policy of Deltec or my employer or any other organization as such, right? These are some of the best practices. These are some of the frameworks we have incorporated, and we're going to talk about some of those data points. All right. So the first thing is understanding unit economics, what it is and why we needed it, right? So this is a textbook definition of unit economics pretty much, right? We talk about cloud unit economics to present the marginal revenues and the costs associated with the development and delivery of pretty much the solutions, all right? The key here is that solutions calculated on a per unit basis, right? So the key here is the unit, right? And this unit could be different for different organizations and different teams and different products, right? And these are some of the examples shown here. These are called per user, and some organizations do that. Some organizations rely on per transaction as a unit, right? So they understand their business model if they're offering their product or subscription or service by the transactions, number of transactions. Um, some are by product, right? Some are by service, right? And or some could be by customer, right? They just want to understand how much it costs us to produce this particular product or a service for a particular customer, right? So these are different units, right? We're going to talk about one specific metric which we think worked best for us, and we have implemented that essentially. But these are some of the generic I would say units, economic or metrics, which are available across the industry. There could be some more depending upon what industry you belong to, which is right, appropriate or more useful for you in this case. All right. Now, since we understand some of the key metrics or some of the unit metrics which are available here, right? So the other piece of information here, which is very important to understand for us, is what are those trigger points? What are those driver points, right? So we know what is unit economics, but why do we need it, right? And what are the driving factors essentially, right? So some of the key pieces mentioned here are, if you see here, rising operational costs. That's one of the most common thing we have identified or we have seen across the industry or in many when we talk to different folks here across meetups or conferences is like, if the operational expenditure is increasing since the shift has happened from an on-prem world to the cloud, if the operational expenditure is increasing, like organizations are trying to understand and get more visibility into the aspects of that, right? They're trying to understand whether it is related to a particular service, particular product, is it impacting our margins, right? And in many cases, it is trying to put pressure on the margins, right? If your operational expenditure is increasing, right? Again, the organizations are trying to figure out whether we should be doing optimization, but in order for them to do the optimization, they need to understand the aspects of the unit economics so that they can do a better job at essentially identifying what is the right area where we need to improvise or what is the right area where we need to focus on in terms of product investments and so on, right? A few other things from a triggers perspective we have identified is like pricing strategy reviews. Many organizations we have seen, or many customers we have seen across the board are essentially trying to understand that their pricing strategy for their products, does it make sense, or is it completely aligned with their margins, or essentially, is it staying up to date with the increase in the operational expenditure, right? Or the new features and all of those pieces. So some of these are some of the examples. There could be way more triggers or drivers behind getting the understanding of unit economics for your particular team or product or organization, essentially, right? That again depends from organization to organization or use case to use case in this particular example. Now, some of the things which I mentioned already here, right? What is essentially we're trying to do from a triggers perspective here, right? What are the key things which leadership generally in many organizations essentially are concerned about, right? Again, these are some of the examples of the questions which leadership may be asking, right? Which essentially we consider it as a trigger point or drivers for essentially identifying what are the best practices for us to roll out the FinOps practice, or what should we be focusing on unit cost as such, right? So as you can see, some of the questions here is like, how should we be distributing our limited technology resources across the board, right? Can we forecast based on unit metrics and sales targets? How can we improve the accuracy of our forecast, right? So these are some of the things which are again tied to those trigger points I just talked about, right? But these are usually the independent questions asked by different leadership teams or different executive people across the board. And we've realized that these, in many cases, act as a driver or a trigger point for many organizations or teams to essentially embark on this journey for FinOps and try to figure out where should we be focusing on cost optimization or understanding or getting this visibility for their team, for their leadership team, and make certain decisions out of that. Now, so since we now understand that what is unit economics and why essentially it's needed, right? What we're gonna look at this now is like what should we be doing first, right? And this is very common thing we have found across many different organizations and people which have raised up in many different forums and conferences is like, should we be optimizing first or should we be understanding the cloud cost or product pricing or economics of their particular product or service first, right? So, in my opinion here, there's no right and wrong in this particular scenario, right? It depends on your organizational needs. If your organization does not necessarily have a cost pressure or cost savings pressure, essentially, right, you could very well go into the model of doing understanding cloud costs and economics first, right, and try to figure out what works best for your organization. Like, where are you spending more money? Where are your optimizing opportunities? Do you need to invest more into the different technology? Is your product pricing appropriate or not, right? And in many other organizations, if you have a cost pressure, if you think that the first focus you need to have is on the cost optimization, then you could talk about your rate optimization. You could talk about right sizing your systems. You could talk about again switching the different technology components, right? In any of the cloud providers, for example, right? So all in all, what I'm trying to say here is that you have to be careful in identifying that what is your long-term strategy, right, and what is your short-term goals. There's quite a possibility that you could also do a hybrid approach, right? Where you could do both of these things in parallel, right? Again, as Finos Foundation talk about different phases, crawl, walk, and run, right? So you have to figure out where do you stand today, if you're literally just starting with the journey or you're already halfway there. What makes more sense for your business goals is essentially going to determine what is the right approach for you, right? So, as I said earlier, there's no right or wrong in this. It is essentially going to tell you, or you should be driving this essentially based on your short-term goals and long-term goals of your particular organization or the team you're supporting. All right, so this is essentially a Finos Foundation. If you will see the graphic here, right, where does the unit economics fit in this intersection here, right? So you can see that you will be doing optimization and automation on certain aspects of it. You have forecasting and budgeting exercises going on with your finance teams, and you have strategy decision making, which will impact your pricing strategy, which will impact your long-term goals of the technology investments and all of that stuff, right? So unit economics is at the center of that essentially, right? So that's what essentially this diagram is trying to tell you is that how these different factors essentially are driven by some of those unit economics metrics, which can help you determine your next steps or next decisions for the organization and can help you in essentially all of these different directions, right? So there's a lot of content available on the Fitness Foundation site, which talks about the unit economics intersection, how different companies have done it, or what are the common best practices or methods to do it, right? So I'll suggest to take a look at it. But we really like this picture, and I just wanted to make sure that we put this here and walk through this quickly. All right, so we looked at what is unit economics and why we need it. Now we're going to talk about what did we do, right? So now this is an example here, right? So we're going to talk about a particular metric which was essentially used in our case. But again, as I said, this is just a skeleton or this is a framework we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about how this metric essentially was born and how does it help in determining some of the key aspects and how this framework can be utilized across different organizations and different teams, right? As they feel appropriate, right? And how this particular metric or this particular example can be used in different organizations to pretty much replicate the scenario of what we have done here, right? So the metric in this case is called per employee per year, which in a short form it sounds like is PEPI, right? Essentially, this is called per user per year. What it means is the cost of having a particular user for a particular product, right? To host that particular user for a particular product in cloud, essentially, what is the cost to produce that, right? That's essentially the foundation of this or the fundamental of this is now, the reason we chose Pepin because it aligns very closely with the products we have. I mean, the name of the products and the way the licensing is modeled is called as employee per year, right? Per employee per year. So that's why we kind of stick to this. But it could be different in many different organizations, right? They could follow per customer per year metric if that is more appropriate for them. Somebody could follow per user per year. Somebody could follow per product per year cost, right? Per service, right? It depends upon what your product is, what your architecture is, what is the metric which is more appropriate for your particular use case. The end goal is that it should provide you a clear picture of profitability, and you should be able to determine your forecasting, your revenue. You should be able to tie all these things together and make sense out of that, right? So in this particular case, that's how we stuck to the PEPI metric here. Now, how do we calculate PEPI, right? This is a very high level calculation, right? What happens in the case of PEPI is that you take the cloud cost, which is your cloud provider's cost. You take some sort of licensing cost, which we usually, many of us, or probably who are in this particular space of cloud using cloud, will be paying licensing costs of either databases or operating systems. And then we talk about the labor cost, which is again your people cost who are supporting this infrastructure or these products, which is, and then we have some shared services costs. Shared services costs are again the common components serving either different customers or serving different products or different services. They cannot be necessarily tied to a particular product or service in this scenario, right? So those are shared services costs. Now, the denominator in this case is the number of user licenses, which essentially I was talking about the number of employees you can use. This is pretty much a synonymous term here between users and employees here, right? So you take this high-level calculation, and then you essentially end up with the PEPI or per employee per year or per user per year kind of a metric for a particular product or a particular service, wherever you want to implement this, right? Now, now we looked at the calculation. Now we're going to take a quick look at the building blocks, right? What does it, how these calculations are essentially, that metric was essentially derived, right? So as you saw, the cloud cost is essentially, again, as I mentioned, these are the different cloud providers, which would include your infrastructure cost or the cost or the cloud native services cost, right? And then you have your labor cost, right? So these are some of the examples here, right? So you could have customer care, you could have SRE teams, you could have infra teams, architecture teams, depending upon, again, your organization, right? What gets considered within that particular product pricing or budget, right? Those are the teams which essentially will fit here. And then you have your licensing cost, right? So again, as I mentioned, you may or may not be using some sort of third-party vendors, right? If you're not completely on open source or if you have some sort of support coming in through these third-party vendors, right? That's where your OS and DB licensing cost will come. Or if you're using a ticketing system, they will have a licensing cost, right? Again, we're talking about that licensing cost. And then we have a shared services infrastructure cost, as I mentioned earlier, right? This is a common piece of set of infrastructure, which is spread across multiple products or spread across multiple services or maybe spread across multiple customers, right? So then we'll talk about certain methodologies here, how we will take that cost and split it across different customers, right? And then you have your user licenses, which are essentially acting as a denominator in this case. Now, this could be different for, again, different organizations. As I mentioned, it is users here mentioned in this particular framework. On this example, it could be transactions, it could be customers, it could be products, right? It just depends upon the scenario of the organization as such. Now, this component breakdown essentially talks a little bit more deeper around each of those components I quickly touched upon. If you see some of the examples in licensing cost, at the bottom of it, it says OS licensing or database licensing or monitoring tools. If you're using some monitoring tools, right? For example, SolarWinds, or if you're using, I don't know, some of the App Dynamics, right? So you'll be paying some sort of monitoring tool, monitoring licensing cost there, essentially in these scenarios, right? Active Directory is a very good example here, right, for shared infrastructure cost here, right, or a security software which is across multiple products, multiple deployments, multiple services, maybe multiple customers, right? How do you take that cost and split that cost across different customers or deployments? Essentially, is the component here for shared infrastructure cost. So I'm not going to go deep into each of these sections, but this pretty much provides a very clear picture on what are these components made up of, right? How do they align still and contribute into calculating the PEPI for this particular scenario. All right. So now, based on that, this is our calculation model. As we have on the left side, if you'll see, we have input data sources, right? With these are data sources which we talked about, just those building blocks. So now this is a little bit of deeper version of that, right? So if you'll see here that we are talking about public cloud costs with tagging on the right side, on the left side, right? We have third-party vendor allocation, which is again, I talked about some of the components of monitoring or ServiceNow or ticketing engines or whatever we have in place. Licensing cost by vCPU. There are again different methods, or there are again different options available depending upon the product, depending upon the service, depending upon the vendor, right? For which you are trying to calculate your licensing cost, right? In case of, for example, Microsoft licenses, right? You could say, okay, that's pretty much straightforward calculated by the vCPUs. But again, depending upon product to product, or the service or the licensing model you have or the agreement you have with the vendor, this essentially will come into picture. Then we're talking about active production products, right? Which is saying here is that do you have some sort of like an internal development spend which does not become part of your pricing strategy, and that is the spend. If it does not get accounted in your case, then you don't want to count that, right? So we're only focusing on the production here, which is essentially tied to the customer revenue. Then CMDB data is another source for you, for essentially you need to get some sort of product information, servers information, customers information that will come handy here, right? So these are some of the data sources we have. And then what you do is you take all these different data sources. There could be more in your scenario here, right? And you ingest that into the calculation model, which we just showed you earlier, right? And then you take that calculation model, and these are the metrics that will be produced by that, right? So now you will have licensing cost, for example, by product or by service, right? Whatever your common or the lowest metric is where you want to calculate the cost for, right? So if we have a public cloud cost by product, we will have public shared services cost by product. What that does is essentially it gives us public cloud cost PEPI by product, or shared services PEPI by product. So for now, each of these components, we will have individual PEPI, right? And I will show some of the sample reports where it will be more clear for us to understand, like, why are we doing PEPI by each of these individual components, because that is where we get help in understanding where I'm spending more money for a particular product, and where do I need to improvise or reinvest, or think about the best strategies there, right? So this is an example of a monthly operational process, right? And again, I know we're talking about how we did it, what we did it like. So let's say we found the metric which we just showed you, right? And now you're trying to essentially to make sure that this is scaling, right? So this is the monthly operational process where again all of these building blocks you put into some sort of a finance model, you do this monthly validation, and then publish reports for your leadership, right? So now this is an example of one of the operation processes, but this could again vary from your needs, or your team's needs, or your organization needs, your company's needs, right? Where you may want to do this, if you're depending upon, are you doing every month, or are you doing every quarter, or are you doing every 2 weeks, right? Again, depends upon all of your business goals here, essentially. All right, so now we figured out what is unit economics, why we need unit economics, and what did we do actually in unit economics, which is came up with the metric which we talked about in the very first few slides: per GB, per user, per transaction, per service. In this case, we focused on per user, per year, per employee, per year metric, right? So now we're going to talk about how what is the actual framework, right? And how do we make sure that this framework scales across the organization, right? Within different teams within the organization, and how does it actually help, right? What is now we know the metric, but what is it going to do for us, right? That's what we're going to essentially look into next. All right, so this framework, which is per employee per year framework, right? If you can see the personas group on the top, and then we have these sources where we talked about different foundational blocks or the building blocks, right? We talked about our cloud resources, or which is essentially based on the tagging, right? And then we have software asset management, and then we have finance tools, and then we have CRM, right? So in software asset management and finance tools, essentially the reason they're mentioned here is that this could be, again, depending upon how it is deployed in your organization, but we're talking more about getting these vendor licenses, agreements, or information, right, or the costing model. How do they cost us, right? Finance tools essentially is going to help you, or either through integration or through some sort of method, to come up with some sort of labor cost, right? What is your people cost across, how this is allocated across different products, right? If it's not allocated by default between different products, then you can allocate it based on some sort of an allocation strategy, right? And then we have a CRM as a source where we talk about per customer. So you're going to get information around the customer, which means that you're going to get information around your how many licenses or employees or users essentially has been given for a particular customer, because that's our lowest factor we're trying to determine the cost here, right? Then you take all these pieces, right? These are some of the metrics, right? From cloud providers, you will get cloud infra. You will get shared infra cost. You will get third-party licensing cost from software asset management, labor cost, and users, as I already talked about. You will take all of these metrics, and then essentially you will ingest into some sort of a, I would say, data modeling engine, or where you have the ability. It could be in Excel in this case, but it depends upon if you want to make sure that this really scales. You want to make sure that you have some sort of capabilities where you can do this on a periodic basis, right? In this case, Aptio has been mentioned, which has the ability to essentially provide you some sort of allocation methodologies or modeling or data modeling capabilities, right? So where you ingest all of these data, depending upon the tagging, allocation strategies, or the business dimensions, you will identify the cost per customer, right? And then you will apply all that metric, or that high level metric calculation we talked about, which is essentially club all this cost divided by the number of users, and you will come by the PEPI for a particular product. Now, once we determine that, right, I think then the next step is like, okay, now we know that PEPI, what are we going to do with this, right? How does it help us, right? Now, this is where we need to think about the original triggers or the drivers, right? So remember, we wanted to understand if our margins are being effective. We wanted to understand if our product pricing was appropriate, right? So we're going to use this information. This is where we integrate with our finance organizations or pricing teams, right? Depending upon different organizations, they may call it different names, but this is where you say, okay, this is the cost to produce, right? The PEPI is essentially cost to produce, or cost to run that particular user in cloud. Now we're going to talk about some of the margins, right? So we then the pricing team or finance teams, they add their whatever business margins are needed, right? And then you take that information, and that's where essentially you take that information and make it essentially available for your sales organization or different organizations who are going to consume that in order for to sell the product, right? So what happens is, with this framework, this skeleton framework, right, you now have the ability, once you identified your metric, right? What is that metric you want to track, right? What is the metric which you are using to sell your product, right? Or whatever metrics which gets translated into that, which makes sense for you, right? Then you identify your sources, which we talked about on the left side. Where this is, what are the what are the all the cost components which are going to be included in making up that cost metric, unit economic metric. You take that, you identify the metric, you figure out your allocation or tagging strategies, You do that allocation, again, as I said, in some sort of a data modeling engine, right, on Excel or Aptio or some other tools available in the market, right? And then you work with your pricing teams to add margins, and that becomes your essentially, now that validates you, right? That validates essentially your product pricing, right? And that also validates, right, are you selling necessarily at the price point where you should be selling, right? Are you impacting your margins here or not, right? And then and one of the drivers was the operational cost, right? The increasing operational cost that we will understand in the next few slides how it will impact, and it will give you information to essentially cut that particular portion, right? Can you figure out that operational expenditure can be either reduced or what needs to be done on that particular portion? So once you got this information for the sales, now they're essentially going to consume it to make sure that you're maintaining your margins and your product pricing is fit, right? Then we took a step further here and we said, okay, now we have this unit economics, right? Can we use it essentially for our budgeting and forecasting, right? Can we use it for making sure that our forecasting is accurate or close to accurate, right? So how did we use that, right? So there's a periodic sync which is happening between giving you information around your user forecast in this scenario, right? Again, as I said, this could be whatever the lowest denominator factor is, what the way you determine your revenue, right, for a particular organization, for a company, that can be used here, right? If you think you're gonna sell 100 customers next year, that's your lowest denominator, right? That's essentially gonna be the forecast for that, right? And then we do a near real-time sync between the PEPI component, like the PEPI costs, a cost to produce essentially, right? And try to understand the profitability aspect of it, right? How are we selling and what is the cost to produce, right? That essentially is going to help us understand our gross margins, right? So that's essentially is we're talking on the left side here is a profitability portion, which will be again done by using some of the finance tools, right? So all in all, what I think the message here is that if you take this framework will essentially allow you to meet all of those questions which leadership is asking you, right? Which are the key driving factors, which are the key triggers, right? It will empower you with the ability to do your forecasting right, because now you understand what are the key metrics I need to forecast, right? And what is the cost to produce to that forecast, right? If you have that visibility, you can essentially do a very quick math and figure out if I'm going to sell 100,000 users next year, right? And the cost to user is $10. Okay, how much do I need to forecast for a particular product, right? Obviously, there is a little bit of forecasting information from sales in this particular scenario, depending upon the business in certain scenarios, right? It will help you understand your profitability better, right? So if you have the unit cost for whatever product you are selling or service you're selling, if that's being sold as a per user or per transaction, and if you know that the cost per transaction is this, and this is the cost per transaction to sell, right? You have a simple clarity of understanding what is your gross margin gonna look like, right? And in addition to that, it also opens you up with information like what is your labor expense specifically for each product, right? What is your vendor expense specifically for each product, and how you should be talking about forecasting some of those pieces, right? So this framework, again, I've mentioned a few times here, this is a framework which some of the components of framework can be applied selectively for certain organizations depending upon their needs. In some organizations, it can be applied in its own entirety depending upon again of the use cases and the organization needs, right? So that's up to you how what you think is makes sense in your scenario and where you take this information and apply it. All right. So we talked about the framework. Now we're going to talk quickly about some of the allocation strategies, right? So these are only two main strategies we have mentioned here. There are quite a few more different allocation strategies which are available or pretty much are applied depending upon, again, your needs or organization needs. What fits best to your model is essentially would work best for you, I guess, or in scenario, in any scenario. But in this particular scenario, what we have those options is like one is called vCPU, right? So where you are simply allocating the shared infrastructure costs or shared expenses, whatever is which you think is going to be very difficult and is to track at individual product or customer or service level, then you take that information and then I mean in this case we said, okay, if this is purely a server-based infrastructure and has nothing to do with other serverless architecture services, right? Then you could use a vCPU methodology and just split the cost accordingly. However, this methodology would essentially fail if you had a serverless architecture, and this may not essentially entirely work if you have a hybrid infrastructure between serverless and server-based architecture. Then the second methodology we have, explored is called weighted cloud spend, where we are allocating expenses to those products based on their proportion of the each proportions of each product's total cloud spend, right? So if we have three different product offerings, and one is our, let's say, the major offering, and then the other one is a smaller or medium offering, and then the infrastructure of that, or one is a single tenant, one is a multi-tenant, depending upon how the cloud spend is happening for each product, right? So there again, you can allocate the expenses of our shared services to those products based on those different strategies, right? Again, as I said, right, um, this applies back to this diagram here, where you would have to have some sort of an engine here where you can apply these allocation strategies, whatever that engine works best for you, and come up with the cost for each product offering will essentially work best for in this scenario. All right, we're going to look at some sample reports here, right? So we have a paper product offering breakdown here. Now, this is a sample. These are some of the fake products I've created here, BizPro, and these are some of the offerings I've created within each product, right? And that is essentially what I was saying in terms of weighted cloud spend. If you have these products, and if you know that the standard product does not have a higher cloud spend proportion, then you can take the shared cost and give the equal proportion of that, depending upon their cloud spend, right? So that it's not like equally distributed between enterprise and standard, even though when their spend is different, when their consumption is different. Now, what this chart is telling us is that the reason I mentioned in one of the slides here is that we have PEPI by each component. We have PEPI for public cloud, we have PEPI for third party, we have PEPI for licensing costs. What it gives me is it gives me a very clear understanding on the fact that how this cost is actually being spent for each product, right? So let's take an example of BizSecure here, where we are spending $36 here on third party vendors, right? So that means the third-party products we are using for BizSecure standard offering is 10. Sorry for that. Biz standard offering is cost us $36 per user or per employee. However, if you see the public cloud cost is $34, right? So what it's telling us is like maybe we're doing something wrong here, which is, or maybe this is right, but we'll have to investigate this, that we are actually spending more on a third-party product, right, than the cloud spend, right? Now, I'm not saying this is entirely wrong in this scenario. This could be appropriated for certain companies or products, depending upon what third-party technology are they using. But this information is telling me that that the overall public cloud infrastructure is costing me less, but then this third-party product may be costing me way higher, right? Or my licensing is costing me way higher, right? Which is $28 here, right? Which is the third biggest component in this chart. So then it gives me information to go and figure out like where do I need to invest money, or where do I need to figure out, do I need to change a technology here? Do I need to look at a different vendor here? Do I need to negotiate my vendor contract here, right? So that visibility is achieved when we break down this PEPI by these different components. Again, these are the building blocks in this particular scenario. There could be different building blocks for your scenario, depending upon, again, as I said, it depends from organization to organization, but this is a framework. If we treat this as a framework, then these building blocks can be easily replaced with some other building block as well, right? The other examples we can take here is, for example, if we take a look at the cloud spend here, or actually the third-party spend here, right? In this case also, there's a scenario, right? So in enterprise, we're spending $22 on third-party. The total PEPI for a user for that product is $200. In standard is 141, but I'm spending $29 just on the labor, right? So this information is telling me that there's fundamentally something going on with the standard offering between different products, or with the use of the different third-party products we're using, right? Now, this is certainly an example here, right? But the point here essentially is that this breakdown is actually giving me the insights which are needed, which will tell me whether I'm spending more money on the labor here. Like in this scenario, we're spending $36 for a labor cost, or the people cost for supporting the standard product, versus $38 labor for the enterprise, right? So it's only a pretty much equal cost. Like why I'm spending why I'm spending equal amount of labor on these two offerings when they're priced differently, right? When they're generating different revenue and may have different margins as such, right? So again, these questions may not be appropriate for you, or they may be appropriate for you depending upon your scenario. But the point here is that, and I'm repeating myself here, is that this framework allows you to have that level of visibility. This is another just another snippet of similar products, right? Where it is telling me how these products are lining up against each other, right? So which is my most expensive product here? I can see Biz Data Enterprise is the most expensive product here, around $200 of PEPI, right? If to produce pretty much, not to sell yet, right? To produce, right? And then what is my lowest one is that Biz Pro Standard is my a kind of a cheapest product to produce for the standard offering, right? So this is just a comparison between their offerings and the products, right? This is just based on the information we have produced as part of framework. Now, um, we talked about this framework. How we can make this scalable and work across different teams within an organization. Now, with all that being said, right, there are key challenges which we have seen that we have faced and many other organizations have faced, or many customers essentially face day to day when they essentially try to roll out FinOps as a practice or even go deeper into the unit economics aspect of it, right? Data accuracy is one of the major challenges we have found is like it's crucial. We know data is important, right? We want to make sure that data is accurate as much as possible, right? Because that's so that you can be confident about your decisions you're making based on that data. If your data is broken and you may not be confident about your decisions and your decisions may not be correct if your data is not correct, right? Um, uh, However, data will not be perfect, right? We have learned that hard way, right? But again, as I said, right, I think this is an iterative journey. You have to make sure your continuous improvement efforts are happening across the data and you're pivoting, you're updating your data points. That's why that framework needs to be in place, that automation needs to be in place so that if your data sources changes or the data tags changes, all of that information which was flowing through different swim lanes can be calculated on its own. All the allocation methodologies can be applied on its own, and then you can produce a number or metric you essentially want to produce for your organization. Um, the second one we have seen is the cost allocation challenges, right? We talked about certain strategies. We have seen organizations moving from one to another strategy. Also, I've talked to a few customers or a few people in the conferences and the meetups, right, where they have switched from one strategy to another strategy, right? So um, because they learned that the strategy did not scale for them or did not work for them as they discovered more information about their products, right? So we still consider this as a continuous improvement or continuous improvement journey here, right? So make sure that you keep evolving and understanding your businesses and features, and then try to pivot accordingly, right? And then the last but not the least one is the adoption barriers here, right? It is hard, right? It requires a persistent effort to make sure there's a continuous education happening within your teams and within different organization groups who are new to this space. They understand the value of the metrics you're producing. They understand that this metric essentially can drive some of those decisions for them, right? And they have the ability to essentially understand this data and have the visibility into the data and make decisions on it, right? So it takes a while for organizations to essentially, or for teams to essentially reach to a mature stage. And the most common way of doing that is education and bringing more people on board, right? Getting an executive support on that, right? And continuous training, and keep I would say socializing essentially your metrics and data points across the organization, right? So with that, it is definitely doable. It's a fun journey, but it's not as straightforward, and it does take a while essentially to be mature in a particular organization, right? Depending upon how hard or efforts you essentially put in, how much collaboration you are able to achieve within your different functional groups, as with different personas we talked about, right? All right. So with that, I think this is the end of the slides. Thank you very much for attending the session. And if you have any questions with respect to the framework, or if you want to hit up with any common question about the FinOps, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, and I'll be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.